Let's talk about Appalachia's Mothman and the disaster people say it predicted. You've probably heard the story before. A small Appalachian town, a red-eyed creature with enormous wings, and a tragedy that arrived 13 months later. The name alone has been sold on T-shirts, sculpted into a 12-foot chrome statue, printed on festival banners, and dramatized in a Hollywood film starring Richard Gere. Most people, when they hear the word Mothman, picture a monster that showed up to warn a town before a bridge fell into a river. But here's the part almost nobody knows. The disaster people say it predicted has one of the most thoroughly investigated engineering causes in American history. The reason the Silver Bridge collapsed is not a mystery. It's a metallurgical report. It's a crack roughly 1/10 of an inch deep in a single steel component inside a bridge that was designed before the Great Depression. So how did those two stories become one story? Why did more than a dozen respectable people, including firemen and a county sheriff, insist for 13 months that something was moving through the woods outside their town? Why did the sightings start on a specific night in November of 1966 and effectively stop on a specific day in December of 1967? And if the skeptics are right that it was simply a large, unfamiliar bird, why can't a town of 10,000 people put the story down almost 60 years later? That's what I want to walk through with you. I'm going to show you exactly what was reported, exactly what was documented, and exactly what has been added to the legend by later authors. I'm going to explain, in plain language, what the National Transportation Safety Board actually found inside that bridge. I'm going to give the skeptical scientists a fair hearing, and near the end, I'm going to show you a single detail from the engineering report that I think reframes this entire mystery in a way most Mothman videos never mention. Stay with me. Because the honest version of this story is stranger than the pop culture version, and in some ways, it's sadder. To understand any of this, you have to understand the geography. Point Pleasant sits in Mason County, West Virginia, right where the Kanawha River meets the Ohio River. It's a river town. It has always been a river town. And in 1966, 3 landmarks defined it. The first was the town itself, small, working class, quiet. The second was the Silver Bridge, an elegant suspension bridge, officially named the Point Pleasant Bridge, opened on May 30th, 1928. It carried US Route 35 across the Ohio River, connecting West Virginia to Ohio. Locals called it the Silver Bridge because of its aluminum-colored paint. For nearly 40 years, it was just part of the commute. The third landmark was called the TNT area. During the Second World War, the federal government built the West Virginia Ordnance Works on land just north of Point Pleasant. From 1942 through 1945, it manufactured TNT. When the war ended, the plant was decommissioned, but the concrete bunkers, the storage igloos, and the internal roads were all left behind. The land became part of what is now the McClintic Wildlife Management Area. Locals hunted there, teenagers drove out there at night, and decades later, in 1983, the Environmental Protection Agency would designate that same land a Superfund site because of munitions contamination in the soil and groundwater. Keep that in mind. A river town, an aging suspension bridge, and a wooded, abandoned munitions complex full of concrete igloos, quietly leaking into the ground. That's the stage. Now for the night, everything changed. November 15th, 1966. 2 young married couples decided to go for a drive. Roger and Linda Scarberry, Steve and Mary Millette. All 4 of them locals. All 4 of them, by every account we have, ordinary young people looking for something to do on a quiet evening. Their route took them past the TNT area, according to the police report filed that same night, and according to the article that appeared in the Point Pleasant Register the very next morning, the 4 of them saw something standing near the road. A tall figure, roughly the height of a man, or a little taller, dark, wings folded against its back, and 2 large circular eyes that reflected the car's headlights back with a red glow. They ran, or rather they drove, fast, back toward town. The headline in the Point Pleasant Register on November 16th, 1966 read, "Couples see man-sized bird, creature, something." Notice the punctuation. Even the local paper couldn't decide what to call it. 2 days later, On November 18th, the United Press International Wire Service picked up the story with a follow-up headline, 8 people say they saw creature. And that's where a small-town oddity became a national story. Now, here's the first thing I want you to notice. The original witnesses did not use the word Mothman. That name came later, invented by a copy editor who was reaching for something catchy in the era of the Batman television show. The witnesses themselves described a bird, a very large, very strange bird. But a bird. Hold on to that detail. It matters more than you'd think. In the days and weeks that followed, more reports came in. A local contractor named Newell Partridge told authorities that on the evening before the couple's encounter, his television had suddenly filled with static. When he went outside with a flashlight, the beam caught 2 red discs in the field behind his house, spaced like eyes, and reflective, he said, like bicycle reflectors. His German shepherd, a dog named Bandit, ran off into the dark. Partridge never saw the dog again. Is that connected? Honestly, we don't know. Dogs run off. Flashlights catch animal eyes all the time. But Partridge was not a thrill seeker. He was a working man, and he reported what he saw to the sheriff. Volunteer firemen came forward next. They told reporters they had seen a large bird with red eyes near the TNT area. Note their exact wording. A bird, not a humanoid, not a monster. A bird, but one they couldn't identify, and they were men who spent time outdoors and knew the local wildlife. On November 27th, according to accounts published later, a young woman named Connie Carpenter reported seeing the creature in daylight near a local church. That account survives mostly through second-hand retelling, so we should hold it more loosely than the police reports. By the end of November 1966, Mason County had a full-scale phenomenon on its hands. Curious drivers were parking near the TNT area at night. Newspapers across the state, then across the country, were running the story. And Sheriff George Johnson, the man officially in charge of the county, was giving interviews saying he believed people were seeing a large heron. Locals sometimes called that kind of bird a shitepoke. So already, within 2 weeks, you can see the pattern that would define the entire case. Real witnesses, real reports, and 2 competing explanations forming in real time. One mundane, one extraordinary, and no way yet to tell which one was right. On December 1st, 1966, the Associated Press ran an article that should have ended the story right there. A wildlife biologist named Dr. Robert L. Smith from West Virginia University told the App that the descriptions matched a sandhill crane. Sandhill cranes are large. They stand nearly as tall as a person. Their wingspan can approach 7 feet. They have a patch of bright red flesh around each eye, and that patch, in the beam of a car headlight, would reflect exactly the way the witnesses described. Sandhill cranes were not native to Mason County. But an individual bird, off its normal migration route, disoriented, hanging around a quiet wooded area with plenty of water and cover, would look, to someone who had never seen one before, exactly like a monster. Dr. Smith's explanation was calm, evidence-based, and published in the middle of the panic. And yet, if you look at what happened next, it barely registered. The sightings kept coming. The story kept growing. The Appwire ran the crane theory, and the crane theory was almost immediately buried under new claims. Why? That's one of the questions I want to come back to, because the answer isn't really about biology. It's about how communities process fear. Through the winter and spring of 1967, the story began to attract people who saw more than just a bird. A travelling salesman named Woodrow Derenberger claimed that earlier, on November 2nd of 1966, he had been driving on Interstate 77 when a strange craft descended and blocked the road. Out of it, he said, stepped a smiling man who introduced himself as Indrid Cold. Derenberger's account was uncorroborated. Nobody else saw the craft. Nobody else met the man. And over the following years, Derenberger's claims grew more elaborate, which is usually a warning sign for any investigator. I'm mentioning Indrid Cold because you'll hear the name in almost every Mothman video ever made. But I want to be honest with you. That thread belongs to folklore, not evidence. It was stitched into the Mothman story later, primarily by an author we're about to meet, That author was John Keel. Keel was a 14 writer, meaning he specialized in stories of the strange and unexplained. He traveled to Point Pleasant in 1967 and began interviewing witnesses himself. He didn't just document the sightings, he built a theory around them. He believed the creature, the strange lights people were reporting in the sky, the men in dark suits who allegedly showed up to intimidate witnesses, and eventually the bridge collapse itself, were all connected. He suggested that some form of intelligence, possibly interdimensional, was manipulating the town. Keep this in mind. Everything Keel documented on the ground is genuine investigative work, but the framework he wrapped it in, the idea that something was warning Point Pleasant of what was coming, only appeared in print after the bridge fell. That's an important distinction, and we'll come back to it. It was a Friday. It was cold. Christmas was 10 days away, and Point Pleasant's small downtown was busy with shoppers. Traffic on US Route 35 backed up onto the Silver Bridge in both directions, cars nearly bumper to bumper, all of them sitting on a suspended span that had been holding cars since 1928. At about 5 o'clock in the evening, the bridge collapsed, not slowly, not with warning. The entire suspended structure, more than 1,400 feet of it, dropped into the Ohio River in a matter of seconds. 32 vehicles went into the water. 46 people were killed. 2 of those bodies were never recovered. If you live in Point Pleasant, you don't need me to tell you what that means. It means neighbours. It means classmates. It means most of a small town knowing, personally, at least one of the names on the list. And it happened, almost to the day, 13 months after the first sighting near the TNT area. The sightings, incidentally, essentially stopped after that night. Whatever people had been seeing in the woods, they mostly stopped seeing it once the bridge was gone. That is the coincidence, and I want to be careful with the word coincidence, because it can sound dismissive. I don't mean it that way. I mean it precisely. 2 things happened in the same town, in overlapping time, and the human brain is exceptionally good at drawing lines between 2 points, whether or not a line belongs there. The question is, does a line belong here? Let's find out what actually made the bridge fall. The investigation into the Silver Bridge collapse became one of the most important forensic engineering studies in American history. It was conducted by the National Transportation Safety Board, and their final report was released in 1970. Here is what they found. The Silver Bridge was what engineers call an eye-bar chain suspension bridge. Instead of using the woven steel cables you see on most modern suspension bridges, it hung from long, flat steel bars linked together like the segments of a chain. At each joint, 2 of these bars connected through a pin, and each bar had a large ring, called an eye, at its end. Inside the eye of one specific bar, identified in the report as eye bar 330, a tiny crack had been growing. It was a stress corrosion crack, which means the steel had been slowly rotting from the inside for years, invisibly, in a way no visual inspection could ever detect. When the investigators finally recovered and examined the bar, the flaw that started the whole failure was measured at roughly 1/10 of an inch deep, 2.5 millimeters, smaller than the tip of a pencil eraser. That was enough, because here's the design detail that mattered. Most suspension bridges of that era used 4 to 6 eye bars per link, so that if one failed, the others could carry the load long enough for someone to notice. The Silver Bridge, for reasons of cost and elegance, used only 2 per link. When eye bar 330 snapped, the second bar in that link was instantly overloaded. It failed. The chain came apart. The bridge came down. That's the answer. That's why 46 people died. Not a warning missed. Not an omen ignored. A hairline flaw in a piece of 40-year-old steel that no technology in 1967 could have found. I told you at the beginning I'd give you one detail that reframes this entire mystery, and this is it. The tragedy at Point Pleasant was not unforeseeable in a mystical sense. It was undetectable in an engineering sense, and to me, that is somehow eerier than any monster. The collapse led directly to the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1968 and the first National Bridge Inspection Program in the United States. Every time you drive over a bridge today and see one of those little inspection date placards, you are looking at Point Pleasant's legacy. So let's take the skeptical case seriously. because it deserves to be taken seriously. The strongest version goes like this. In November of 1966, some combination of large birds, probably including a sandhill crane blown off its migration route, possibly barred owls, possibly a snowy owl, possibly a great blue heron, was seen at night in an unfamiliar setting, near an abandoned munitions site, by people whose headlights caught the red reflection off the bird's eyes. Owls in particular have silent flight and produce eerie sounds, and they have generated monster reports across the world for centuries. The first sighting made the newspaper. The newspaper made more people look. More people looking generated more sightings, some real, some misidentified, at least one, according to the skeptical investigator Joe Nickell, confirmed to have been a hoax. There is even a preserved snowy owl at the Mothman Museum, shot locally in 1966 by a man named Ace Henry, that was described at the time as a giant owl. Then, 13 months later, the bridge fell for reasons that had nothing to do with any of it. 3 years after the collapse, a book connected the two stories in a way the town has never quite been able to shake. And here we are. That is a coherent, evidence-based explanation. It accounts for the reflective eyes, the size, the wings, the clustering near the wildlife area, and the way media amplification can turn a handful of reports into a phenomenon. But if we're being honest, it doesn't cover everything. The colour red is unusual for owl eyeshine, which typically photographs as yellow or orange. Sandhill cranes don't easily explain the reports of a figure standing upright like a man, and the biological explanation says nothing at all about why the sighting window closed almost exactly on the day the bridge fell. Skeptics will tell you that is our brains inventing a pattern after the fact. They may well be right, but the pattern is real, the dates are real, and a good investigator has to sit with that discomfort rather than explain it away. So let's put the pieces on the table. What we know for certain is this. Something was reported by multiple, named, credible witnesses in and around Point Pleasant, beginning on the night of November 15, 1966. Those reports were documented in police records, in the Point Pleasant Register, and on national wire services within 72 hours. The Silver Bridge collapsed at rush hour on December 15, 1967, killing 46 people, due to a stress corrosion crack roughly 1/10 of an inch deep in a single eye-bar of a bridge with insufficient design redundancy. Both of these facts are settled. What we don't know is exactly what the witnesses saw. The mainstream biological explanation, a wandering sandhill crane or one or more large owls, fits most of the details, but not all of them. We don't know whether the concentration of sightings near a documented Superfund site had any environmental cause. We don't know how many of the later reports were misidentification, how many were social contagion, and how many, if any, were something else entirely. What is genuinely disputed is the meaning of the timing. The paranormal reading, popularized by John Keel in his 1975 book and cemented by the 2002 film, treats the sighting window as a warning. The scientific reading treats it as a coincidence given emotional weight by a grieving town. Neither side can prove the other wrong, because we are no longer arguing about evidence. We are arguing about how humans make sense of loss. And that brings us back to the title of this video. Did Mothman predict the Silver Bridge disaster? The most honest answer I can give you is this. The bridge fell because of metallurgy, not prophecy. Something was seen in the woods outside Point Pleasant for 13 months, and the most likely explanation is a large bird that most locals had never encountered. But the story survived because 46 people died, and because human beings, when confronted with that kind of loss, reach for a story large enough to hold it. A monster in the woods is, in a strange way, easier to carry than a 2.5mm crack in a piece of steel. Here is what I keep coming back to, and I'd love to hear your answer in the comments. If the Silver Bridge had never collapsed, would anyone outside Mason County still be talking about those sightings from 1966? Or does a tragedy need a monster attached to it before a community can bear to remember it? If this investigation gave you something to think about, please consider sharing it with someone who loves an honest mystery, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Every share genuinely helps this channel reach the kind of viewer who wants the real story, not the recycled version. Next time, we're staying in West Virginia, and we're going back even further, to a night in 1952, when a group of witnesses on a wooded hillside said they encountered something that did not seem to belong to this world. Locals still call it the Flatwoods Monster, and the official explanation, a meteor and a startled owl, has never fully convinced the people who were actually there. Same state, same tension between folklore and official record, and a set of witnesses who spent the rest of their lives insisting that whatever they saw that night came from somewhere far above the trees.